famous diplomacy festival for organizing this event. Then Centro Studi Americani and its wonderful staff was working really hard behind the scenes to make this all happen. Thank you so much for hosting us in this magnificent premises. But of course, also sincerest thanks to each and every one of our highly distinguished speakers who have joined us from different corners of the world or of the city today. And each of the marvelous students have populated this room today from Tor Vergata University's Global Governance Program. For those of you who are not familiar with Diplomacy Festival, we're celebrating our 15th birthday this year. And we're doing so with an event themed around power, looking for creators, power, and its countless faces. Complex title, a lot that could be said, and I hope everyone in this room will agree with me that there's no better part of the world than the African continent to explore the myriad faces through which power manifests itself. However, Africa being a very complex continent of 54 nations, it'll probably take us a full week, if not an entire festival, to dive deeper into the complexity of the countless faces of power across it. That's why in discussion with the festival's organizing committee, we thought it appropriate to slightly narrow down the geographical perimeter of today's event and pick one particular part of the African continent that for different reasons also fits very well the theme of today's session, West Africa and the Sahel. Between geopolitical rivalries and the struggle to control energy sources and the need to govern migration flows and military presence from multiple powers, some old, some new, West Africa offers various examples of the countless faces of power. Cutting across all of them is fragility. West Africa is probably one of the most unstable regions in the world these days. And since 2020, an unprecedented series of 8 coups d'etat ravaged across the region. Some of them happened suddenly, Gabon, for instance. Others very sadly spiraled into open conflict, Sudan. Others resulted into pretty interesting regional diplomacy showdown, such as in the case of the so-called Sahel exit involving Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And again, between the European Union and the US and Russia and China, plus some new actors such as Morocco, Iran, and Turkey, many eyes are on the region. Hence, we're lucky today to have assembled an unprecedented lineup of absolutely outstanding speakers who will help us navigate the complexity of this West African power puzzle from different standpoints: academia, regional institutions, the private sector, and also civil society. I'm going to go straight to it, but in my capacity as chair of today's session, let me also offer some housekeeping rules, because again, we have a lot to discuss, but not a lot of time to do so. So I would like to propose the following structure. I'll go through each of our 4 speakers, and we'll hear from each of them for about 8 to 10 minutes. And I'll have to be very strict about timing, so I'll have to excuse myself on that one. Then I may want to use and abuse my chair's privileges to perhaps ask a quick round of short follow-up questions when, if need be, maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes max, at which point I want to definitely leave ample time for Q&A with our students, who I'm pretty sure are ready to fire their pertinent and highly impertinent questions. So stay with us through the end, 90 minutes in total. On that note, I suggest we go straight to our first speaker, Dr. Samuel Ramani. Dr. Ramani is an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London and the CEO of Pangea Geopolitical Risk. He has 2 books on Russia's foreign policy and a 3rd one in the making on US foreign policy in Africa. And he's a regular contributor to such unknown broadcasters as BBC, CNN, Sky News, and so forth. Now, Dr. Ramani, I hope you'll agree with me that we need to sort of, start painting a little bit of the picture. And I hope you can help us do that, including by tapping into your Russia expertise. I also hope you'll agree with me that there seems to be a little bit of a regional market for security across West Africa, which Russia has been pretty effectively tapping into, either via Wagner or after the fairly spectacular disappearance of good old Prigozhin by its own army. And at the same time, again, I hope you'll agree with us that all of these developments seem to have also pretty interesting international diplomacy repercussions. Because if you look at the voting outcomes for the UN General Assembly resolution that was voted to condemn Russia's illegitimate aggression of Ukraine in early 2022, 35 countries abstained, including 15 from Africa, including countries from the region. What's going on across this mess? What's Russia's role in it? And what are the key power themes that you see emerging from it? Dr. Ramani, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
All right, yeah. Thank you very much, Carmine, for your very kind introduction. It's really great to be here in Rome at this festival for the first time and to address all of you about such an important topic. And what a year it's been for the Sahel, right? With all the wave of coups that we've been seeing and Prigozhin's death and Russia's kind of reincarnation after that. So I'm going to kind of go through briefly by setting the stage about how the region has developed and what circumstances brought Russia into the region, what Russia's influence in the region looks like, and where things might go from here. So it's going to be a little bit backward looking, a little bit forward looking, and a little bit of empirical analysis of what's happening in the present day. And I would like to begin by comparing the current geopolitical environment in the Sahel with the geopolitical environment of the past. And there's a lot of continuities, there's a lot of consistencies between past and present that I think we shouldn't overlook. Yes, there's some new factors like terrorism, this clash, this systemic rivalry between Russia and France around anti-colonial narratives, and also like a lot of the entry of regional powers more pronouncedly, particularly from the Middle East into the region. But there's also a lot of continuities and parallels that we're seeing too. For example, if you flash back and just look at the histories of Chad and Niger, you see histories of two coups d'etats happening in Chad and Niger during the Cold War era, multiple attempts on Idris Déby's authority in 2004, 2006, 2013, multiple coups in Niger happening 1996, 1999, 2010, and the years that followed. You also had a history of international powers, basically some acting as status quo powers, some acting as revisionist powers that would seek to overthrow the existing system, with France kind of supporting authoritarian stability to advance its own interests and its own ends as part of the Franc-Afrique policy, defending Chadian dictators who are pushing Africanization forcibly and who are trying to divide the country between North and South, between Muslim and Christian for their own ends. And we've seen disruptors before in the region, like Russia's taken on. In particular, I think Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya and all of his machinations in Chad over the Cold War era, not ending in a very ill-fated invasion, which looked a lot like the some parts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine going on early on, being some examples. So we have that history of unstable civil military relations and the meddling of regional powers, with some powers being status quo and some powers seeking to disrupt the system with oil wealth, financial resources. But there are also some new things that have been brought into the equation. I think just the sheer multiplicity of actors that have entered the Sahel landscape, from China, Russia, European Union, US, and many of the Middle Eastern regional powers like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. It's a lot more multipolar and multi-vector than what we've been seeing in the past. And this current massive wave of sustained transnational terrorism is also something that's quite interesting and extraordinary, as is the rapid succession transnationally of military coups across, effectively creating a coup belt that extends from Mali in the west all the way to Sudan in the east with not really any interruption. So there's some things that are quite different. And in this atmosphere of disorder, and in this atmosphere, there's a question about Russia's role. Is Russia a player that has caused and contributed to this disorder, as many people often think, or is Russia just simply a mercenary that's kind of opportunistically profiteering from the chaos that surrounds it? And I would argue very firmly that Russia is kind of a country that's thriving on disruption and chaos, and not necessarily a country that is, for the most part, instigating the chaos. So even in Niger, I think there were a lot of debates as to whether the Niger coup was to some extent instigated by Russia because of its friendliness with Christianity, because of the movement of some Nigerian and previously Malian officials for training inside Russia. Some people around Zelensky certainly put the blame on the Russians. But I think that Russia is more of a power that's revanchist, that's capitalizing on disorder, and that's kind of where things are. So how did Russia rise and how did Russia emerge in the Sahel in this new geopolitical environment? It's interesting that during the Cold War, obviously, the Soviet Union did try to establish some clientelistic relationships in West Africa, to some extent with Mali, to some extent with Senegal, but it never really had the kind of geostrategic foothold in the region that it would have in the Horn of Africa with their foothold in Ethiopia with the Derg regime, or in parts of Southern Africa where they leveraged their opposition to apartheid to build close relationships with Angola and the opposition to colonialism to build a presence in Mozambique. So West Africa was not a region where the Russians are historically strong in, and perhaps the multiplicity of partnerships that we see today from Russia is more than what they've ever done. So how was Russia able to pull this off, especially as the Cold War era was footnoted in between by 20 years of broad disengagement from the continent and relatively limited involvement in this region, aside from pursuing some isolated gold mining concessions in and around Timbuktu? Well, I think the starting point for the new Russian resurgence was 2011. It was the NATO military intervention in Libya, which was corresponding with a small arms proliferation and was followed very rapidly by the 2012 coup in Mali, which pitted the Tuaregs against the central authorities. The Russians, who acquiesced to the no-fly zone by abstaining in the critical UN resolution that backed it, but then turned into critics of the NATO intervention, blamed France, the United States, and NATO for all of the ills and all of the instability of the region, and blamed what happened in Libya, the overthrow of Gaddafi, for what happened inside Mali. And they also started spreading and beginning to set up their information war machineries, where they basically said that the French and the Americans are not coming in here to fight terrorism. They're coming in here to use terrorism as a pretext to steal our resources, to steal the uranium, to steal the gold, to steal the oil, steal whatever they can find, and take it for themselves. And initially, that message really was not really considered very much. The French went inside Operation Serval. The coup in Mali was reversed. And then Operation Barkhane began, and Russia didn't really do much to counter it. But Russia did plant some seeds of anti-colonial, anti-Western discontent that would strike a chord with populations years later. So as the situation in the Sahel stagnated in terms of economics, then after 2016 rapidly deteriorated with the rise of transnational terrorism and the general conflict of threats, like from food insecurity to climate change to so many of the other problems that were affecting it. And the Russians were able to present an alternative model of counterinsurgency in Syria that looked somewhat effective. They were able to support Bashar al-Assad's return to power. They claimed to fight ISIS, even though they really weren't. And they presented a model of counterinsurgency that involved supporting ex-state institutions and supporting authoritarianism, rather than forcibly trying to spread democracy onto people who, weren't really clear whether they wanted it or were actually being involved in it. Suddenly, Russia got some appeal and was able to get some points that were quite resonant. And they also were able to accomplish some strategic results in Central African Republic. So they had a model of authoritarian stability-based counterinsurgency that was seemingly yielding results in both Syria and Central African Republic. You had rising terrorism, rising food insecurity, climate change, economic decline, and interventions from the West in Operation Barkhane, France and the United States that seemingly were not gaining much traction. And this allowed the Russians to step in. And this is how we started seeing Wagner first enter Mali, and then now we've seen on a much smaller scale instructors enter Burkina Faso and Niger. We've seen military juntas gain widespread popular support by aligning with Russian narratives about the corruption of Western powers and the plunder of resources, and engage local civil society on their behalf. And even though Russia's military operations in Mali have been woefully ineffective at times, as we've seen with the Ukrainians and the Tuaregs massacring Wagner Group's soldiers more than once, and the fact that they've been plundering resources from the continent also, they managed to maintain a strong and durable foothold in this region. And with the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, they managed to some extent centralize their operations under the control of the Russian state and the Russian Defense Ministry, and even achieve some periodic results. Like, for example, just like the way the Russians were lacking food and lacking shells and lacking ammunition in Ukraine, they were even lacking it even more acutely in Mali in 2022 and 2023. But after Prigozhin's death and after the mercenaries were reined in to some extent, we're starting to see, more war material, more helicopters, an expanded base, and some results, including in Kidal, at the end of 2023. So the Russians have established a robust regional presence, and they're here to stay. But their rise is not necessarily a cause and a trigger of the disruption. It's a reflection of a changing, increasingly multipolar international system, and it's also a reflection of the disorder that we see around us. And Russia is thriving and capitalizing on that disorder. So where do things move from here? I think that, Russia's presence is going to endure, but Russia has limited material capabilities and also has really few prospective partners. China's Belt and Road is kind of at odds with the destabilizing tactics that Russia is using. Turkey pays lip service to Russia's anti-colonial narratives, but doesn't really cooperate with Russia to a significant extent. The Gulf monarchies are kind of pursuing their own training and other programs, and France and Americans are adversaries. So Russia is having to go it alone and rely on fragile autocracies to maintain its influence. And also the cycle of fragile autocracies might also come to an end. Just like there have been waves of coups in the past, those waves of coups have been undone. And an example of a country that imperfectly, but somewhat effectively has managed to do that is Mauritania, where they managed to stop the wave of coups after 2008 and 2009. And they're slowly becoming a nexus for geopolitical competition between the Russians and NATO and many other regional powers, while having a nascent green energy industry. Of course, there's deplorable human rights and semi-legal slavery there and lots of other problems, but that just shows an example of how geopolitical contestation does not necessarily need to lead to rampant disorder, and how this wave of coups in West Africa, just as they came, might eventually, with changing circumstances, undo themselves, and Russia will find themselves largely stuck, isolated with limited military or material capabilities and few partners.
What a journey. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramani, for so effectively compressing so much helpful information in such a limited amount of time, and for sticking to the allotted time. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. I don't know whether we now feel more comfortable with the complexity of the region or we're more confused. Either one is absolutely fine, because it's perfectly in line with the purpose of the event, that speaker by speaker, we get an additional perspective and start recomposing the pieces of this fairly complex regional power puzzle. So I think we've now painted the landscape, right? And got some really interesting insights about the role that one particular power has been playing across the region for a number of years now, Russia namely. But I do think it's time that we start getting some perspective, institutional perspective to it. And that's why to call on our second speaker of the day, the Honorable Emanuela Del Re. Honorable Del Re is currently the special representative for the European Union for the Sahel, and she was former deputy minister for foreign affairs and international cooperation here in Italy. But very importantly, she is also an expert on migration and refugees, conflicts, religious issues, etc., all of which, again, are on full display in our regional power puzzle. Now, Dr. Del Re, thank you very much for being with us. I'm a movie lover, and those of us who are like me, movie lovers, may remember Matteo Garrone's I, the Captain, or Io Capitano, Oscar-nominated movie that came out earlier this year. So if you watched it, and if you haven't, I do recommend you do so, you may remember that scene set in the middle of Niger, Agadez, showing what an important role Niger, and more importantly, the Sahel region plays for migration routes, including those that bring internally displaced people, refugees, and economic migrants all the way into the European Union. Very conservative estimates suggest that on average, about 100,000 such migrants have been using this route every year since 2000. And data available also suggests that about 3/4 of migrants that arrive into Europe, typically via Italian coast on boats, those who are lucky to make it through that very dangerous journey, do it through the Sahel. So the Sahel, and more broadly the Sahelian region, definitely plays an important route for that mission that the European Union seems to have given to itself in terms of trying to govern migration flows. The EU also has a number of initiatives active across the region and in the entire African continent, more broadly speaking, such as the Global Gateway, for instance, which in a way could be considered as the European response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, all of these insert itself into the broader piece of the recently adopted EU Pact for Asylum and Refugees. So, Excellency, how do you see all of this complex power puzzle from the perspective of the European Union through the lenses of your being a specialist on refugees? And what's our way forward? Excellency, thank you very much for being there with us. The floor is all yours. 10 minutes for you. We cannot hear you, Excellency.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can, loud and clear. Please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this interesting initiative. Actually, migration is one of the lenses that we can use to look at the Sahel. In the introduction and description made by the previous speaker, of course, there are some elements that are important for the Western Sahel and for the Western Africa, but obviously the situation is much more articulated. And as I said, migration is one of the elements that have an impact on the general situation, and also on the position of the international actors regarding the Sahel, and vice versa, the position of the Sahel and West Africa towards the international actors and global actors, as we want to call them. Well, first of all, I want to tell you that in my long interlocutions with the most important actors in Africa, from heads of state to obviously also civil society, that means researchers, activists, students, and people who are creating a critical mass of thinking to obviously make Africa a more influential continent in the history of the world. I can tell you that what emerges very strongly in a very powerful way is the fact that they are aware of their position, and of course, even regarding migration, they are aware of the fact that this is an element that can be used in our partnerships, considering that we call our relations partnerships, meaning that we have to act together, we should coordinate, we should decide together what to do for the future. This is far from being a reality, but nevertheless, we have laid the basis for this kind of approach, and the global gateway that you were mentioning is one of the outcomes of this idea of creating a partnership, meaning that we decide together what is most important for the development of the countries of Africa. In particular, I, of course, make a reference to West Africa. And of course, I say in terms of a long-term perspective, rather than just intervening at humanitarian aid level, which is very necessary, but also must be accompanied by strong development policies. Regarding the issue of migration, of course, I can say that, first of all, we have to be aware of the fact that migration is much more important south-south rather than south-north, in the sense that I always praise the countries of Africa for their efforts in welcoming and managing migrations, because they are the countries that are really affected by the phenomenon, and they are the countries that slowly are developing also a system that can be more structural and could be more, let's say, responding better to the needs of the populations, considering also that we have internally displaced people due to climate change, to terrorist attacks. We have refugees that come from one place to the other. I always go on the ground to visit the camps. I was recently in Chad at the border with Sudan, visiting the refugee camps that Chad has put in place, of course, with the help of international organizations, but Chad has done it on its territory and it's managing the situation. The same could be said for Mauritania with these transit routes. So we can see that, in fact, the phenomenon is very much on the shoulders of the African countries. Of course, we also have an effect, and we know very well in Italy is very much debated, But I think that we should distance ourselves from ideology and try to find better solutions in order to create a situation by which we have legal migration, and also we solve the problems at local level, because in fact the countries of Africa themselves are asking for this kind of support. Just to give an example, unfortunately we had this coup d'etat last year in Niger, but we had also a very important center of the IOM in Agadez, which I visited several times. We have many other initiatives, and in Mauritania recently, everybody knows, we have given a packet of 200 million euro for the management by the country of the migration routes, transit migration routes. So closing this, let's say, section on migration, I can say only that we need Africa to solve the situation regarding migration. And we also have to say that Africa needs us, but we have to work in a coordinated way, because we all have ideas. And I have to say that we can learn a lot from the way the countries are managing in Africa their problems regarding migration, because in any case, migration is a serious problem and needs to be approached in a long-term perspective. I would like anyway to also make some comments on what has been said before. Of course, we can focus on Russia, but Russia has been in Africa for decades, is a very good friend of the Africans, was very much supportive during the independence movements, and today is a sort of brother that helps in a moment of crisis, and in a moment in which the countries, especially some countries of West Africa, feel disoriented. It seems as if it is offering an image of solidity, when of course we are all instead quite shaken by what is happening, especially regarding the war in Ukraine. This is painful for me, because I represent the European Union, but it's also something that we have to approach with a sort of rationality. We cannot be emotional about this, in my personal view. I think that Russia, and I think also that the African countries know this, Russia is offering an illusory support, because in the end, I deal with these matters every day. I realize that, for instance, regarding Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger, they are offering some support, but the support is an illusion. It's a support that cannot last, is not sufficient, but it is given an illusion, and especially is used by the Africans to tell us that we have abandoned them, and the Russians instead are somehow helping the countries. So it has become this Russian presence, of course, very negative for us, because we consider Russia a malicious actor. But at the same time, for the Africans, it's a good way of showing that they can make the difference. Because you, I think, Chair, were mentioning the fact that they have the opportunity, of course, of voting in the United Nations, and their vote counts, which was not so important in the past. And now the Africans are very aware of this, and they know that they count, they can make the difference. And of course, this has a cost in terms of political partnership, and also of a partnership that is based on a true cooperation that brings concrete results in the long term. Because so far, somebody was telling me yesterday in another event that the European Union has failed over the years. We might have not been able to convince completely the countries of West Africa, or in general the Sahel, because I would say that in West Africa, really, the difference between the different countries is immense. But in general, we might have not convinced completely, but we are still the main partner in the region. And also we have done a lot, because without our development cooperation programs, without our very consistent support, without our humanitarian aid, the countries would have found it very difficult to survive and to proceed. Although, of course, we are now witnessing results that are not the results expected according to the investments. Now, the problem is that we want to remain engaged in terms of European Union, coming to the role of the European Union. We are an interesting actor, but we are in a crisis ourselves because the competition at global level is very big. I'm not talking about Russia or China, because as I said, they are there since a long time. But for instance, we have very big powers that want to become more influential, and we have to renegotiate our position in relation to these powers. For instance, India. India wants to become the leader of the global south, and has demonstrated to be able to make the difference because they are obtaining results such as the inclusion of the African Union in the G20, which means adding 54 countries grateful to India in the G20, which is something significant. But also others that are now present from the countries, from Saudi Arabia to Egypt, that wants to play a stronger role, and many others. So the problem with the European Union is not that in West Africa countries are not looking at the European Union, because the European Union remains a very important element in the history of recent history of Western Africa in terms of let's say model of welfare state, for instance, to which anyone could aspire, because welfare states are very let's say weak in the region. And of course, if we want to look at the model, every Western African would say that a good model is the model of the European Union. But at the same time, we are not convincing in terms of capability to indulge in a dialogue. And I know, because I have been fighting a lot to bring a new perspective, a new language to the region from the European Union. And also the fact that, unfortunately, at the moment, we are not providing something that is absolutely essential to the countries of the Sahel, which is support in terms of military equipment in particular, or training to fight against terrorism and the security in general. Because
Excellency, let me interrupt you for a second, because your time is up. So I would like to invite you to come to conclusion for now, and then I want to circle back on this, because this is very important.
I want to conclude. I was just concluding. Thank you very much, because I'm looking at my chronometer. And anyway, just to conclude, I wanted to say, so we are in a crisis in a sense of being less influential because we are not responding to this. But this is the moment in which we can reorganize our image and our capability to remain the main partner, which we are, I insist, still now, although all the narrative, anti-Western narrative, and in particular anti-French. And of course, this allows us for a moment of of change, and also to become more mature in approaching Africa, because Africa is more mature, and we have not understood this. But the European Union, I think, has the instruments to be able to respond, especially to the new demands of the Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was a perfect way to both start diving deeper into the landscape we had painted with Dr. Ramani, getting some institutional perspective from what remains a key actor across the region, but also, getting a bit of a reality check in terms of to what extent we still need to get our own act together before we can offer some practical solutions about the region going forward. And I particularly like, among the many valuable insights you offer, Excellency, what you said about South-South migration, about African governments taking ownership of the future of the region, and of course, the role of the people. And I think that's a perfect segue into the next segment of this session, for which I'm calling on our third speaker, Dr. Ebenezer Obadare. Dr. Obadare is the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., and a fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute of Theology. He's also had a fairly successful career as very successful actually, as a professor of sociology at Kansas University, and he regularly contributes to very prestigious journals papers such as Foreign Affairs and the Wall Street Journal. He specializes in civil society and the state, as well as religion and politics in Africa. And all of those lenses, I think, are very pertinent for us to continue assembling our power puzzle across the region. Now, Dr. Obadara, there's two things I'd like to discuss with you, right? One taps into your civil society expertise, and the other one into your background as a Nigerian, now based in the United States. Because on one end, we've all seen images of those massive popular protests, which in some cases result into pretty unexpected regime changes across the region. So we'll be really curious to hear what's your own perspective in terms of what role the people might have played, either into buying into this narrative that some foreign actors might have tried to push upon them, and or be in driving those processes forward. But also coming to your Nigerian background, this also comes from my own experience working extensively with regional economic communities across West Africa. I hope you will agree with me that we've seen a fairly different reaction to the latest series of events from the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of Western African States, compared to what we used to see back in the 90s, for instance. Back then, ECOWAS used to have fairly muscular responses to instability across the region, including via the use of military force, as we saw in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and Gambia, just to name a few of the places where ECOWAS sent regional troops back in the 90s. Look at what happened now. There's a coup in Niger. ECOWAS issues an ultimatum. No more care about the ultimatum. The ultimatum gets withdrawn. Then Niger, alongside Burkina Faso and Mali, announced their withdrawal from the Economic Community for West African States, so-called Sahel exit, and now they've actually implemented it earlier this year. So what's your take on that, and what role, if any, you see for ECOWAS in shaping the future of the region? Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for the kind introduction, and nice to be here. I'm going to try and answer the two questions by telling you two different stories. So the first story, the first question is about people power and people's yearnings for democracy in West Africa. So Senegal, in the westernmost part of West Africa, offers us a very instructive set of events here. So what happened in Senegal? The immediate past president, Macky Sall, decided, he surveyed the rest of West Africa and the rest of Africa, and he decided that he was going to take a chance and he was going to extend his term of office for an illegal third term. If you were in his shoes, you wouldn't blame him. You will actually understand. It's coming from a continent where several leaders have been in power since the collapse of the Roman Empire, right? President Museveni of Uganda, Nguema in Equatorial Guinea, Biya in Cameroon, Kagame in Rwanda. These are leaders who have been there for decades. So Macky Sall felt that, look, what is it? Why do I have to quit when I can do what some of these leaders have done and extend my stay in power? And this is where your people power comes in. He mooted the idea, trade unions, student unions, market women, journalists, several elements within that broader construct that we call civil society came out and said, no, you will not do it. What did former President Macky Sall do? He sent soldiers and police to the street. More than 20 students of Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, the capital city, were murdered. How did people respond? They still said no. Ultimately, the Senegalese Constitutional Court ruled against what the president was trying to do, proclaimed it unconstitutional, and ordered that the election that he was trying to postpone, that election should take place. A couple of things that I want you to take away from this. One, obviously, from the latter part of what I just said, is about the supremacy of the rule of law. If you are someone like myself who grew up under the military in Nigeria in the 80s and 90s, and has always thought that the rule of law is essential to building a free and democratic society, you root for what what took place in Senegal. But that's one. But the second thing is the role that ordinary people, market women, really poor people, community-based associations, journalists, groups that have connections with the diaspora, NGOs, the role that they all played in coming together and saying, we're not going to have this. We prefer a system where we elect our own leaders. We think leaders should stay for a particular term of office, after which they should shuffle off. And it's interesting that we're talking about Senegal. But remember, this is one of the few countries in Africa that has never experienced a coup d'etat. So there's a lot riding on it for ordinary Senegalese. They did not want to go in the direction where some West African and other African countries had headed, and they did not want to find themselves in the destination in which they had found themselves. So that's one way I want to encourage you to look at people power. But it then raises the question, for some of you who have been following events in the region, what about Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso? What about all those people who came to the streets, flying Russian flags, welcoming soldiers, right? What about all those guys? What's this guy talking about? I did this piece for the Wall Street Journal. You can pull it up at your leisure. The title is Why African Crowds Welcome Coups. That's the title of the piece. It was published in the Wall Street Journal. And the basic point I was making, which reality has since then has borne out, is that those people who took to the street, young people, weren't necessarily welcoming coups d'etat. They didn't suddenly fall in love with soldiers overnight. On the contrary, they were expressing their frustration and their discontent at the poor quality of democratic governance in those countries. If you don't believe me, think about what has since happened in those countries. So I did this piece on my Africa in Transition blog, I think last week, called Fear and Loathing in the Sahel. Now, I was making the point that in nearly all these countries, rising disaffection with the military has led to a situation where the military has started mowing down those very people that they are supposed to support and the very people who troop to the street, apparently to welcome them. So the key point here is that the hunger for popular rule, for democratic rule, for representative government persists in all these countries, and the veneer of military rule and military juntas fostering and saying that we're there, we're representing the people is utterly false. That's one. Second question is about ECOWAS. ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. It was established in 1975. Next year will be the 50th year of its founding. That's had a lot of ups and downs since it was established. But the key element in the establishment, if not the continued survival and progress of ECOWAS, one of the most powerful regional groups in the world, one of the most successful, I would say, is Nigeria. There are 16 countries in West Africa. The population of 15 of those countries is less than half the population of Nigeria. Nigeria's GDP is 60% of the GDP of West Africa. What does that mean? It means that the rest of West Africa matches to the beat of Nigeria. Why is this important? Over the last 25 years, since it became a civilian, a democratic government, Nigeria itself has no longer has the muscle that it used to have. It's a distracted country. Whereas it used to be the diplomatic leader, South Africa appears to have stepped into that role. As Nigeria's role has helped, other elements, other countries in that region have become more assertive. Ghana being one of them, Senegal being another. But something happened, and I'm coming to the end now, something happened when the current president, Bola Tinubu, came to power last year. He immediately became the chairman of the Economic Community of West African State Leadership Group. And he came out, there was this conference that they had in Ghana, the capital of, in Accra, the capital of Ghana. And he said, no more coups d'etat in West Africa. not on my command, not on my watch. We're not going to have it. 2 weeks later, there was a coup in Niger. Soldiers overthrew President Bazoum. It was the fact that President Tinubu had basically stood on his mother's grave and vowed that if there is another military intervention, I'm going to squelch it. I'm going to make sure it doesn't succeed. That accounts for the role that Nigeria consequently played in trying to mobilize the rest of ECOWAS against that coup d'etat. So it's worth keeping that in context. I think all of us who believe in democracy, who want a prosperous, economically stable and viable West Africa, has to support ECOWAS. And I think to that extent, the breakaway group formed by the so-called ASS states, Association of Sahel states, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, I think it's much to be regretted. And I think one of the interesting things that has come out of that is the way in which Nigeria has supported Ghana and Senegal to sort of try and rein those states back in and bring them back into the fold. I'm really optimistic that that could happen, but it's also worth keeping in mind that one of the reasons why these states run by the military have decided to go their ways, not just because they want it, because of what my colleague here has also mentioned earlier, which is about the role of Russia. Russia is playing an increasingly destabilizing role in the region. And one of the things that it's trying to do is to diminish Nigeria's influence by strengthening all these smaller states, and then encouraging the military to be in power as a way of positioning itself and reducing Western influence in the region. Thank you.
Even below 10 minutes, you're a champion. Thank you so much. That was a very refreshing perspective, both of what happened in Senegal as a testament to the fact that the power of the people does matter, but also to the fact that regional integration continues to be one of the engines of prosperity and economic security. However, in some cases, it kind of gets caught into intra-regional rivalries. We're going to get back to that. But speaking of Nigeria and also more broadly of getting different perspectives, I think it's time to also hear it from the private sector standpoint. And so on that note, I'm pleased to introduce our fourth and last speaker for today, Dr. Raffaello Materazzo. Dr. Materazzo is the head of international affairs and business support for sub-Saharan African Americas at ENI, which, as we all know, is Italy's largest oil corporation. Is being a senior analyst in the International Affairs Institute here in Rome, as well as a senior advisor to the Italian Parliament. And he himself has also had a successful career as an academic, having been a lecturer on strategic studies at University of Perugia here in Italy, as well as at St. John's University in the US. Now, Dr. Materazzo, we've established now that access to energy is one of the lenses through which we should look at this power puzzle in West Africa. I've also heard that Nigeria obviously is a key actor in that puzzle, and it has a long-standing presence in that country and across the region. We also know that West Africa is rich in both traditional but also new energy sources. I'm thinking of Niger again, which is the world's 7th largest producer of uranium, as well as critical materials and rare earths, which are key for the energy transition, and over which China seems to have established a fairly dominant influence vis-a-vis United States and the European Union. Finally, of course, circling back on the role of the people and on supporting local livelihoods, obviously the private sector has been playing and shall continue to play, I hope you will agree with me, a very important role in supporting those livelihoods and creating employment opportunities for the people across the region. So what's your take on all of that? What's ENI been doing in this space, and how it can continue contributing to the socioeconomic development of the region, including through its charitable work under the ENI Foundation? Dr. Materazzo, thank you very much for being with us. 10 minutes for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this gentle presentation. Thank you very much for the excellent previous speech, in particular the last one, which was very refreshing, because I agree. We often have in Italy or in Europe a distorted perception of what's happening in Africa. We do not see the lively activity of the civil society. We do not perceive the sensitivity to democracy. And for example, if you look at the data, the number of local elections in Africa for the administrative institutions is growing. The number of overall elections in the countries over the last decades has been growing. So there is a trend, long-term trend of a continent which is waking up from the past. And for example, I don't know how many of you know which year any entered in Africa. No one. Any entered Africa the year after it was born, which was 1954 in Egypt. And so we are in Africa since more than 70 years. And when ENI entered in the mid-50s, the percentage of the energy market, which was controlled by national oil companies, local companies of the country, was much lower than 5% of the overall energy market of Africa. If we look, and the rest was managed by the international oil companies. If you look at it now, today, we have national oil companies which are involved in the production of local energy, more than 60% of the overall market, while the remaining part is on the yacht. Is it a good news or a bad news? Is of course a good news for the ownership local people, because this means the international oil companies developing and producing in Africa have thought local companies to develop, and this was to develop. Of course, international oil companies still today grant international standard and local development projects. We have, as ENI, very important project with the World Bank in Ghana, or now more recently in Kenya, on the energy transition, shifting, for example, in Ghana, the energy production from oil to gas, because we, in a project supported by the World Bank, in full respect of the international standard, give 100% of the gas we produce to the domestic market. And this is why the World Bank decided to support this project. Or there are a number of other, in Nigeria, for example, where ENI entered in the 60s, we have developed the Green River Project, which today involves more than 100,000 people, mostly female, in the agricultural sector. And I could continue with a number of projects, but the point is that ENI has always been more sensitive to the local dimension, calling its approach the dual flag approach, the flag of the company and the flag of the country. And this is based on an historical reason, which is linked to Enrico Mattei, to the founding father of the company, because Italy was, ENI was the energy company of a country defeated by the Second World War, with no domestic energy in Italy, so had a stronger need to enter in a market which was, even at the time, extremely competitive, which much bigger the Seven Sisters and the story of the bigger company. And so Mattei invented the reason why the Mattei plan today by the Italian government has been named in his honor, which is the so-called Mattei formula. I don't know if you are confident with the Mattei formula. The Mattei formula leaves, while the other energy company were leaving just 50% of the production to the local market, ENI was leaving 75%, including the support to the growth of the national oil company, which were helped in the development of and in acquiring capacity building and competencies. So now, how this translates in nowadays activities. The good news is that from talking about the scramble for Africa, which was the title of the books of the last century, now we are talking about the African Agency. Carmine was referring at the beginning to the UN resolution of early 2022, where 15 African countries did not align and abstain from the resolution of the UN condemning Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, which is a demonstration of growing independence, non-alignment. So it's extremely interesting how African governments are playing this growing agency and autonomy, which means, of course, even growing competition. But at the same time, it is extremely important, even referring to the presentation of Manuela De Rey, to the cooperation with the European Union, with the Western institutions, to remember that the international standard and international prayers grants in the continent are extremely important. I can make the example of the project of energy transition that we have recently inaugurated in Kenya. It's not West Africa, but it is part of the same story, and which is supported by IFC and by the Italian Climate Fund, the first project by the Italian Climate Fund in Africa under the Mattei Plan, because it's a project which involves today 80,000 farmers, local, who produce together with food from lands which are arid and not in competition with food. They produce feedstock for the production of biofuel. They squeeze this feedstock in agri-hubs, which Eni has realized. And this oil is transported to Italian biorefineries for the production of the biofuel, which you can already find in our street. The HVO is biological fuel, is a biofuel, is a biodiesel, which contributes between 60 and 90% of the abatement of the CO2 emissions. So this is a kind of energy transition. I don't know how much time I still have. This is a kind of project which talks to Africa in terms of energy transition, because involves support the local supply chain, involves a high number of working people, transfer technologies, and develop a new industry, possibly for the global market of biofuel, contributing to fight emissions. This is why the World Bank and IFC have supported the participation. The IFC, of course, is not only a financial participation, because to be supported, the project was submitted to a long due diligence. The World Bank talked to all the farmers, all the aggregators, all the players involved in the project to control. They came to Italy to control our biorefineries, to control that the standards are high. And let me say that the standards of the Italian Climate Fund in terms of climate sensitivity are even higher by this point of view. So this is a small example of how international companies today can support an energy transition which is not perceived as coming from up to down, in a continent which still today has 600 million people without access to energy. So in Africa, there are more citizens than live in Europe, who today live without access to energy, and still will continue to be, according to the forecast, in the next decades. So talking about involving African citizens into the energy transition needs the involvement of people, of local communities. And I close, mentioning even clean cooking, improved cook stoves, which kill every year 4,500,000 between women and kids. And we are distributing for finance, carbon finance, 10 million cook stoves in the next decades in Africa, to try to improve even these. So these are examples of a kind of energy transition which can work in a continent which is still very different from us, but which has this lively level of public opinion sensitivity, even in the control of international players. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Matarazzo. That's exactly the complementary piece that we were missing into our puzzle. Okay, we've done the round. I think we're doing pretty well on time. So I am going to abuse my chair privileges, but just for a very quick round of follow-up questions. And this is now with me wearing my academic hat as a lecturer myself, because when we talk about this and many other complex issues with my students, I always remind them that, you know, we need to do the analysis just like we've done now, but then we need to do the synthesis and try and offer some practical solutions. And it just occurred to me that West Africa perhaps presents itself as the perfect example of what might now be sort of an ongoing rivalry to determine a new global order or disorder. This very week, while we're sitting here, the annual meetings of the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund are occurring in Washington, D.C., while the two Bretton Woods institutions are celebrating their 80th anniversary. In parallel with this, Russia is hosting the BRICS summit, which is now with an expanded format. And it is not by coincidence, I would say, that the two events are occurring exactly in this very week. It seems to be a bit of a provocation, to say the least. So all of this clearly is at play in terms of geopolitical rivalries in our West African region. And so I want to go around our lineup of speakers just for a minute or two. Really, just a very, very short reactions from each of you in terms of the following. If you had to pick one priority, be it a policy, an action, or a project, to ensure that West Africa, as you were saying, becomes finally a stable and economic prosperous region, what should that one, just one, policy or programmatic priority be? And I'm going to mix up the ordering a little bit. So let me go to the Honorable Dere first, who's been patiently waiting for us on the line. Your Excellency, you have the floor for a minute or two. Your one policy priority or action to take forward.
I have two priorities, one for the European Union and one for Africa. One priority for the European Union is to enhance its ability to act as a group of 27 member states, because for the moment, unfortunately, the bilateral relations prevail for a number of reasons, but I have been fighting against this and trying to make it more European, but at the moment, the diversities amongst the 27 have had as a result of the fact that more countries are acting at bilateral level with very different approaches. And of course, this is prevailing. For instance, Germany is a giant and of course doesn't care about the position of others and is acting very strongly in Mali, while, for instance, France is trying to keep us all away from the region. The second priority, of course, is security. If we don't intervene at security level, everything will collapse, because the epicenter of the phenomenon of terrorism mixed with criminality is in Burkina Faso, for instance. We are not helping Burkina Faso. We are not, of course, supporting Niger and not even Mali, and therefore the effect, the domino effect in the coastal countries, it's very strong, and all the rest you can imagine as a consequence. So I would say, multilateral approach rather than bilateral from the European Union, and trying to find a way of promoting security and also African ownership in security measures to solve the problems that affect the region. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Regional unity and security. Dr. Abadare, you're up next. You're one or max two, let's say, priorities for the region. Maybe one for ECOWAS and one for civil society.
This is easy. The late former president of Ghana said, "Seek ye the kingdom of politics, and everything shall be added unto you."
One second. Your Excellency, we invite you to mute your microphone if you don't mind.
Sorry, because my battery is going. I don't know why.
Take your time. Don't worry.
I was asked.
Dr. Abadare, please carry on.
The late Kwame Nkrumah said, seek ye the kingdom of politics and everything shall be added unto you. If you look at every survey that has been done of young West Africans ages 18 to 25, what do they want? They want regular electricity. They want governments to be more transparent, less corrupt. They want internet. In other words, they want all those things that young people ages 18 to 35 want all across the world. How do you get those things? If the political substructure is not right, if governance is not attended to, if you don't have proper democracy, you're not going to have a chance at doing any of those things. Focus on politics and you'll get the rest right.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Dr. Ramani, you're up next. You're 1 or 2 max priorities for the region.
Yeah, well, some of them have already been kind of touched upon, but I guess that the one that I would like to talk a little bit more about is connectivity and kind of empowering regional institutions, because what we seem to be seeing right now is that the only kind of connectivity is occurring between autocracies in West Africa, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, with the AES, or basically through connectivity from transnational terror groups. So it's the wrong kind of connectivity. I think that one of the issues that we've seen with the African Union and the slow movement or the inefficacy of the standby force after years of training to be able to step up to the plate has been a significant challenge. We've been seeing some promising signs of, or at least attempts at regional mediation happening elsewhere, like Luanda, like the process with the DRC and Rwanda. But in Horn of Africa and East Africa, just the rivalries that we've been seeing between Kenya, Uganda, on the one side, as well as this Egyptian, Eritrean, Somalia axis versus Ethiopian Somaliland is plaguing also West Africa too. Not enough regional mediation and arbitration taking form. And also, I think we need to see, more expanded and more serious regional economic integration. The question is, can it actually occur in the field of energy, in particular renewable, green energy, solar energy, harnessing the natural resources of that territory, as well as speaking to what our colleague over here said, the 600 million people who are kind of without connectivity in terms of telecommunications. And finally, there needs to be a bit more integration in the and harmonization or autonomy or agency occurring within the information space. Because one of the gateways, obviously, for Russian influence to enter Africa is often disinformation, right? Whether it be exaggerated narratives of a colonialism, or whether it also be the argument that it's war in Ukraine is not what's causing food insecurity. It's just a mixture of sanctions and mining of ports and things like this. There needs to be more agency and autonomy in the information space. So connectivity in energy, connectivity in telecommunications, connectivity in regional institutions, and connectivity in the information space could help in West Africa, and there's African precedents all across that we can look to see how that can work.
All right, thank you. Dr. Matarazzo.
My priority would be local development and just transition. What we mean with just transition is the transition in full respect of human rights, civil rights, transparency, rule of law, local population, local needs, and full involvement of local community. There is a growing attention of international organization, the UN, on UN development goals, access to water mixed with access to energy, and this is the real challenge of our of next year, granting access to energy to 100 million of people, not burning the country and the continent. And this is very important for a continent which is still working on this, and this, let's say, is even very respectful of the global dialogue. The position that African countries took before the COP28 was very important, very committed on decarbonization. And even if they want to use gas and some of the less polluting hydrocarbons, to grant access to energy to the 100 million people which still don't have.
Okay, fantastic. We've spoken enough. Now it's your turn. I'm wondering whether we have any fantastic help with circulating the mic. So I'm officially opening up the Q&A session. Let's do maybe 20 minutes. If we can stay for an extra 5, I suggest we take questions in batches of 3. Let's make them questions, not speeches. And let's please introduce yourself very briefly. Say your name, where you're from, whether it's university or maybe something else, and then if there is one particular panelist that you want to direct your question to, please do so. Sir, you're first.
Hello, I'm Pedro Magnasco from Global Governance, and I wanted to ask you how a criminal organization like the Black X influence this kind of multivectorial sphere, this kind of very, very energetic context, and how this influence can break the equilibrium or move it. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. There was another one. Yep, there's one here and then one in the back. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Preslava, and I wanted to ask to each one of you, like whoever wants to answer, do you think that it is a bit disingenuous, the fact that Russia is being blamed by the international community of being opportunistic on the continent, since the West has a much longer history of actually exploiting and involving themselves in the affairs of the African states? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And then there was a third question in the back there, please.
Yes, I'm Diego Del Valle from Global Governance also, and I wanted to ask especially to Mr. I don't know, I didn't catch the name. Sorry, really sorry, but always about like the Russia team, because these countries that were overexploited by the West power for centuries, I think it's pretty normal that are turning their back to the West to look at Russia or other powers. You mentioned like also the Soviet Union, Cuba, with the case of Angola, etc., etc. And so I think the question, unfortunately, pretty similar to the one of Preslava, like is a bit hypocrite for the West maybe to talk about that, about the Russia intervention.
Excellent. Two closely connected questions on Russia and then a separate one on the evil axis. Which one? Who wants to take which one?
Can I take the one on Russia and
Yeah, we're going to get a quick repeat of on the first question, which some could not hear, and then we're going to go to you, Your
My
Honorable.
question is
Okay.
how criminal organization, especially very big multinational criminal organization like the Black X from Nigeria, can really influence this type of politics, this type of equilibriums inside the countries. Like on the, sorry, maybe the name is wrong, but okay. But my question is if they move equilibriums, and if they move equilibriums, how? Because it's a very subjected to a lot of forces environment.
That's okay, Pietro. Thank you very much. That's the beauty of having students in the room. They are so difficult questions that sometimes you don't know what to say. So we're going to go to the Honorable DeRay first, and then we're going to do the running in case anyone wants to chime in on any questions. Excellency, please.
Yes, no, I wanted to answer the question on the West that has been exploiting Africa for a long time and Russia. I think it's a good question. Both of the students put it in a different way, but it's the same concept. I think it's a good question in the sense that this particular issue is a part of the current anti-Western, anti-French, in particular in West Africa, narrative. I think it's more than a narrative than a reality in politics. I have the great privilege, I've had so far the great privilege to enter into politics from the politicians, let's say, way of acting, in particular in negotiations. And I can tell you that one thing is narrative and ideology, one thing is to be concrete and very rational. I would say that there is a lot of criticism, there is a lot of request for more understanding, but at the same time, there is no turning their back to the West, because as I mentioned, even in the most difficult situations, when you talk to the politicians, when you make agreements which are very concrete with millions of euros and so on, you discover that the countries still ask for a solid partnership with the European Union. recently I spoke to high representatives from Niger, and they said that they want to intensify the relationship with the European Union, of course, on a different basis, more contemporary. But I have been advocating for more contemporary responses to the current needs, because we cannot adopt the same approach that we adopted 20 years ago. The situation has changed, Africans have changed, and of course we need also to change to adapt to this new scenario. But I want to make it clear, we as European Union are still the main partner, which tells you a lot. And for us, it should be a huge responsibility, because we know that through our programs, just to give you an example, in Mali, despite the military leadership, despite the coup d'etat, we still have millions and millions of euros ongoing in development cooperation. We are still amongst the main providers of humanitarian aid, which means that they are not turning the back to us. They are asking for change. And of course, in some cases, they are also using a very negative ideology, because this is the kind of moment, also at philosophical level, that is going on in the region. There is a lot of transformation also at intellectual level, and I think we have to follow it closely. But one thing is ideology and narrative. One thing is when you make agreements and you come to the point of putting on the table concrete measures to solve very serious problems, like the problems at humanitarian level, security and development cooperation level. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Excellency. Dr. Madrazo, you want to complement the answer on Russia, or maybe take the very difficult one on the black axis, if you know anything about that? And then we're going to go to this
yes,
side.
Me too. I don't know exactly the name of the movement, but let's say organized crime has always been part of the picture and part of these kind of international relations. The point I want to scope is has been already made by Honorable Debre, which is, of course, today there is more global competition than when the Bretton Woods agreement were signed after the World War II, or even more than 40 years ago. But at the same time, there is much more global interdependence, as was saying Madame Derre. Interdependence means that we have several levels of reading of the reality, and that the kind of dynamics that we read are no black or white, or in one sense or another, and no silver bullet exists in reading international relations, in particular for a continent which is coming up on the stage now. And this is interesting for Africa, because the great opportunity, when I talk about agency, I mean discussing with China and even with the US, discussing with the EU and Russia, and having different kind of approach. There is no one color that the continent will get, like it was probably in the Cold War, but there are multi-dynamics, and I think that this is, in particular for Africa, this is going to continue. Now, the European Union has a great opportunity, because in terms of energy security, there is a huge complementarity. Europe needs energy, and Africa has a lot of energy resources. They are close, and so the cooperation, I fully agree, can be further implemented, but in a context and in a world which is changing, and with a player like Africa, which is much more vocal, assertive, and must be heard and read much, let's say, better than we often do, even here.
Excellent. Thank you. Any further thoughts on this one? And then get ready for the next round of questions. We're going to definitely take one more, or perhaps two, if time allows. Dr. Ramani, please.
Yeah, so with regards to some of the questions that we've gotten about Russia and the West and the double standards, I think that obviously there's a lot of parallels that you can draw between some of the Western miscues of the past and what Russia's done. I mean, France and the Franco-Freak policy, the support for authoritarianism, even more recently, you know, building such close relationships with Idris Deby in Chad or Khalifa Haftar in Libya under the guise of basically, you know, opposing Islamic extremism. So supporting supposedly secular leaders against that. I mean, and what Russia does in terms of autocracy promotion, you can make that parallel. You can make parallels between obviously colonialism and what the Wagner Group has been doing in terms of the plundering of gold and diamonds and other precious metals from the from various African countries. But there's all and the Chinese also play and develop that too, because they're talking about win-win partnership and comparing that to neocolonialism of the past. Turkey brings that in to some extent also when they invest to some extent in infrastructure in West Africa, or they invest in training and development in Somalia. They make those kind of parallels and foibles. But there's also some uniquely harmful and deleterious aspects of what Russia is currently doing to the regional system and to the regional order, from embracing and overtly embracing extra legal turnovers of power on a consistent basis, as we've seen in the Sahel, from encouraging, kind of kleptocratic, mineral resources for arms deals with some of the most nefarious figures in the continent, whether it be with Mugabe and the Darwindale mine in Zimbabwe, or whether it be with Hemeti in Sudan. I mean, this is a very serious issue. Whether it also be, the weaponization of food and just the rampant latching on and the spread of disinformation, and also the habitual selling of arms to both sides of individual conflicts, whether it be the Badme War in Ethiopia and Eritrea, arming both sides in the aftermath of that, or in Sudan, backing both of the rival generals at once. I mean, there's a lot to call attention to. And the striking thing is while there might be things that, Western countries have done that might be frustrating about, there's also substantial investments in public health and development and other things. Even with China, there's investments in infrastructure, there's investments in things that are contributing to the development. Russia's economic footprint from a positive standpoint is not really very much there. I mean, the total amount of foreign investment is standing at $400 million. Their trade relationships are largely imbalanced and in a cumulative way, 1/3 that of India, less than that of Turkey. I mean, there isn't really that kind of, positive reinforcement that the other powers can also bring to the table. So that's what makes their role slanted so much towards the negativity. And that's something that's quite interesting to note and to point out. So yes, there are double standards, obviously. There are real grievances inside Africa, but why is all this aid going to Ukraine, and why is nothing really going to Sudan or to the Sahel? And there are a lot of anti-Western frustrations that Russia's tapping onto. But aside from playing the politics of grievance, they're really not offering an alternative in terms of a model of governance or a model of development that other countries can come to. China, say what you want about them, they are trying at least to some extent. Russia's not doing it at all.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Ebeder, any final reflections from you on this one? And then we're going to take 4 more questions.
I think it's a great question about Russian opportunism. But I think the way to get a handle on this is to look beyond Russia for a moment. Just think about, I'm going to give you a list of countries that are involved in different parts of Africa in different capacities: trade, security, military, technical assistance, whatever. Russia, China, the United States, EU, France, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Iran, right? Just a range of countries, not your traditional superpowers, but other middle-level powers that you don't normally think about. What do they want? The same thing, right? The United States wants to extend its influence in Africa for strategic reasons. Russia wants the same thing. China more or less wants the same thing. They have different methodologies and approaches, but they all more or less want the same thing. That's actually right. From an African standpoint, things couldn't be better. You're like the 18-year-old young woman in a village of men, and you are the only woman. And then you're saying, yeah, what do you want? What do you have for me? Yeah, a Tesla? Nah. What do you have? A Porsche? Oh, okay, maybe I'll think about that, right? From an African point of view, things could not be better. And this is the crunch. This is where the key element comes in. For those countries, right? And the element of what does Russia want has to be balanced with what does the United States, for example, want. And the ball has to be kicked back to those African countries. Because don't forget that Russia on the one hand and the United States on the other hand, and I'm putting US, France, EU in the same part, they offer contrasting models of governance. It's okay for you to go with Russia, but do so with your eyes open. It's also okay for you to go with France, with United States, with EU, but do so with your eyes open. It's a moment of fantastic opportunity for African countries. It's up to them to play it the way it serves their own interest best.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Obadere. I'd be curious to know which is which among those actors between the Tesla, the Porsche, or perhaps the Fiat Panda, but we have no time for that. So let's go quickly back to the audience for maybe 4 quick questions, and then we're going to close by 6:05, 6:08 max. Please, be quick. Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to ask, I'm Luca Toscano. I wanted to ask about this current state of Africa integration. We talk about ECOWAS and how much it is important in the current state. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. That's question number 1. Let's get another one from here.
Okay, so I'm Arianna, Napoli. I don't want to open a Pandora's box, but this development foreign aid is not always supported by an authentic questioning of Western practices in the West African territory. So, and also sometimes there is another problem because development aid comes into place under the conditions of the supporting country. And this is not always a good instance of empowering, but keeping power ties with the country. So how do you see these ambivalences? Can you elaborate on it? For instance, we have Ghana and the toxic landfill for fast fashion, Western fast fashion, and other instances. So can you elaborate on that? Sorry.
Excellent. Thank you. You see the level of difficulty is raising. Get ready for that. It's going to be 1 question each. 4 questions, 4 speakers. Come on, let's go for the third one.
Since there's no.
I thought you already had a chance.
Yes. There is one other. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm thinking. Okay. My question was like to Emanuele Del Re that responded me before, and is like yes, EU is like concluding a lot of good deals with African countries, and I sincerely don't know a lot of them, like this one with Niger, but the ones that I know with Al-Sisi of Egypt or Sayed from Tunisia or the 2 governments of Libya are all deals that are promoting EU, but in a way that don't reflect the real values of EU, because are deals that are done with dictators that don't respect human rights and that cause.
Okay, you're talking about migration deals, is that right?
Yes.
And the question is?
Partnership deals.
And what is the question?
The question is the same as before, like the hypocrisy of some of the values promoted by the EU and these deals.
Okay, and then 4th and last, if there is any. Nope. Speak now or forever hold your peace, as they say at weddings. All right, good. Your Excellency, would you like to take that point about EU deals? Please, go ahead. Let's try and be shorter than the previous round so we can close quickly. Please, go ahead.
Okay, this idea of deals is very complex, as I said, because, for instance, in Mauritania, we were asked by Mauritania to support them in their managing of migrations. So, as you can see, of course, it's quite complicated in the sense that we want to contribute. And, of course, there are many problems regarding human rights. We cannot deny this. But, of course, at the same time, we have to make an attempt. So, at the moment, I think the model is developing, and I think that we have to support this path of let's say increasing awareness and contributions also from the countries of origin and transit. I think we have to go in a prudent way. I think that we have to explore more ways and to be more precise, but I think that it is the moment in which we have to finally find ways of creating legal pathways for migration. The second point I wanted to say, this hypocrisy, it's very difficult because either we act or we don't act. And the problem is that if we act, because I think that we have to act and we have to continue to be a major actor, which we risk not to be as European Union, in that case, of course, we will find a lot of difficulties because, of course, if we look at Africa, it's very difficult that there is a perfect country with a perfect democracy and everything is going, joyfully and guarantees all the respect of everything. And I come to the first question the second question, when somebody was asking about development and the fact that we put conditions. I want to tell you very clearly, and I want to explain something technical because I'm in front of students and I am also a professor. When we talk about support or development cooperation and of course investing a lot of millions in development cooperations, we put conditions that China, for instance, doesn't put or Russia doesn't put, such as human rights, respect of human rights, and in the case of countries where there has been a coup d'etat, return to constitutional order. This means that we do not suspend the support for development cooperation, which has been in West Africa ongoing for about 5 or 6 decades. So you can imagine how long the tradition of being supporting local community is for the European Union and the European Union member states. But at the same time, we find ways of not supporting directly the country where there has been a coup d'etat because we want to continue to insist on the need to return to constitutional order, which means elections, a democratic climate for the society, not restricting the civil liberties and other things. In that case, what do? We suspend the budget support that goes directly to the state, but we continue to erogate funds for development cooperation through, of course, NGOs. The NGOs work necessarily with local NGOs, and in this way we guarantee that we proceed, but of course respecting our own principles. At the same time, also promoting and protecting our interest, because it is in our interest to make sure that there is a development in these countries, because our future is in common, there is no doubt. And therefore, we need to create a situation in which the countries can develop their own ownership, and of course, they are asking for our help, so we do so through systems very complicated and technically complex that guarantee that we respect also our principles. And I want to say very clearly that one of the problems we find in asserting our way of proposing development cooperation and so on is the fact that we talk, for instance, about human rights. But Nigeria knows very well, because when
Excellency, sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're out of the time, but I think message well received. And thank you so much for addressing 2 out of the 3 questions. That was excellent.
The point is
clear. I want to give our other speakers also an opportunity to offer some final thoughts. So we have one question about Africa integration that still remains unanswered, and then 2 questions, one on aid conditionality and another one on European deals. Who wants to speak to which one?
Yeah, I can say a couple of sentences about migration. I understand that it's getting a lot of attention, but I think, and I understand what the EU representative was saying about, making sure that things are done within legal parameters. But I think one thing that is often left out of the conversation about migration is what African countries lose when young people, energetic, intelligent, creative, when they leave the continent. Right? 20,000 graduate students and professors leave Africa every year. That's a lot of drain, right? That's a lot of hemorrhage. So in as much as I agree that we should work on the legal process for helping immigrants, I think much more important perhaps for African leaders and European leaders, policy makers, something to consider is how to help Africa keep its best people in various aspects of life.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Ramani, feel free to speak to any of the 3 questions, but just one of them, not all 3.
Focus on African integration, I think, because that's the one that hasn't been touched on yet. Yeah, obviously that's an issue that's of significant importance, because it's obviously important for African agency to strengthen and for African institutions to become more proactive, because one of the big challenges that Africa has faced has been the selective engagement or disengagement of Western powers. Like you can see that in the split screen between the debates about, in NATO intervention in Libya, and then a year later, the 2012 coup in Mali, where the Americans pondered various forms of indirect or direct military intervention to undo it, but then ultimately backed off. And that early disengagement kind of France took the lead. France went in unilaterally, didn't really engage much with the European partners, and the Americans just kind of played a supporting role. And the result was the prolonged, rather cacophonous intervention. And we're seeing that even more pronouncedly in Central Africa, obviously, too, where Central African Republic has gone through massive upheaval. It's particularly in 2013, and then in the aftermath with the ex-Seleka rebels taking over large chunks of the country, and them having virtually no major international support, particularly after the French left in 2016. And then that vacuum was taken over by Russia, and the Russians took it over to the point at which they don't only control the mines, they also controlled the lumber mills and the breweries, and the bodyguards to the president and the national security advisor for a period of time were Russian. So that Western tendency of selective engagement or just blanket disengagement from vital and large areas of the world that are suffering from extreme poverty and extreme instability is a significant problem. And the solution to prevent predatory powers from stepping in is to strengthen and congeal the African regional institutions. But we're seeing IGAD has got a history of trying to get involved in different crises, but also having a reputation for acting slowly. That dates back to some of the Sudan crises of the 1990s. And with ECOWAS, we saw a situation where Nigeria was trying to enforce and lay down the law with the Niger junta, but there were doubts about whether it had the military capability to act on that. And also some member states like Togo and others were not really necessarily wanting to join. And there was the countervailing influence of powers from not in ECOWAS, but in the regional neighborhood like Algeria also stepping in. So we're seeing, inconsistent action, slow action, lack of cohesion amongst the regional institutions, and that's a significant problem, as well as slow movement that's allowing more, these vacuums to get worse.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Matarazzo, any final words of wisdom from your end?
3 tweets. Immigration. When you talk about immigration in Africa, more than 90% of migration is intra-African, among African countries, as you were saying. And development and support to development is even more challenging because, as always, when people go to university, develop and get more money, the first input, like probably for all of you, is to travel, to go abroad, to move, to leave your country, to leave your continent. So not always, or the contrary, rarely, support to local development produce staying. So migration and movement of people is the future of our developed world, and we have to face it in a changing even our mind. And in this sense, I think that, so what you are willing is the same that young Africans are willing to learn languages, to travel, to know the world, to work abroad. And regional integration, Luca raised this point, if I'm not wrong. Regional integration, when multilateral institutions are in crisis, regional cooperation, integration, and regional organization are the key to face these challenges. So, for example, the cooperation between the European Union and the African Union is extremely important. The role of ECOWAS, the role of local organization, the input to the African Union, which is appointing the new commission in February, is extremely important. And we are, let's say, pleased to know that the best partner of the African Union is the European Union. And there is even the IFCFTA that we have not mentioned, the Common Market of Africa, supported by regional organization, which is another important point. And Arianna, development aid, once again, we have to listen Africa, and you have to study Africa to understand what is it, what's the real continent that we were hearing. So there is a relevant part of you for students to understand how to support and to integrate the local trends and to go beyond the stereotypes that we often still hear today.
we're gonna continue the discussion in the side because we have to close the event, but as you can see, your question, like everyone else's, has attracted a lot of attention. So on that note, I will not attempt to summarize this wonderful and incredibly rich discussion. Let me just close by perhaps picking up on one takeaway from each of you, right? Because I think by now we've established that this region is way too complex for us to look at it through just one set of lenses. We need multiple ones. And also we need to look at multiple options for solutions. Local development and access to energy and electricity, as you rightly mentioned. Information and connectivity, including to prevent interference for foreign actors. The power of the people and the importance of empowering them for them to make them active agents of change. But then, of course, also security and picking your development partners using the right criteria. This is some of the solutions that I think we can bring together as our way forward for the region and beyond. And since we spend a lot of time analyzing problems, again, there's no one size fits all solution for all of those problems. And there's different categories that we all need to use to try and understand them. The program in which you all are enrolled, I think, is a testament to that. I'm familiar with your curriculum, being a lecturer at Tor Vergata University myself, and I think it equips you with exactly the right multi-thematic and multi-sectorial tools that you need to try and recompose this very complex power puzzle. So on that note, thank you very much, everyone, for having stayed with us. Thank you to Centro Studi Americani for having hosted us. You're going to find the recording from this event on the website from the Diplomacy Festival over the next few days, but stay connected because the festival runs to October the 25th. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon. Cheers.